Hey, this is Mike Robbins. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. Hope you're doing well, you, your family, your team, everyone around you. I want to talk today about being humbled. I've had a few experiences and conversations over the last couple days that I have found myself with a real sense of humility and not humility per se, just like being humbled, actually, which I guess there's an aspect of humility in that. But I want to sort of unpack these experiences and then talk about the power and importance of us really embracing being humbled by life, being humbled by things that happen. And, we can think of being humbled kind of in a positive and negative connotation, if you will. So over the weekend, I participated in a 5K run here in our town of Novato, California, where we live, a little north of San Francisco. And I guess they have this run every year. Pardon me. I've never participated in it. It's the Lucky Run. We, have it around St. Patrick's Day, and it's a fundraiser for the high school. And anyway, I run a couple times a week and have been for the last few years. So I was like, oh, I'll sign up for the 5K. There was a 5K and a 10K, and I thought, let me just start with the 5K. But I was feeling excited about it, a little nervous, hadn't done a race like that in a long time, but pretty confident. And then I found out the route that they were doing the race is actually a place where I run normally. So I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And then I show up and, I'm up early and I'm stretching and doing my thing and remembering back to the days when I was a little kid when I used to do 5K runs with my dad around Lake Merritt in Oakland. And anyway, the race starts and I go and, it was fun. It was interesting. There was a decent number of people there and people cheering and I kind of get off to a decent start and I realize, wow, this is different. I'm not used to running quite this hard or this fast. I don't usually have other people running with me. It's not being timed. It's not a race. And I wasn't like thinking I wanted to win the race. There were definitely a handful of people there I could tell were like pretty experienced runners. And I was like, okay, those people are going to be the ones competing to actually win this thing. But I noticed as I was going, I was getting more and more tired. And I think it was a little longer than 5K just for the record because some of the little markers. And anyway, I was trying to sort of pace myself. And as I was getting out, people were passing me. And I was really grappling with myself as I was on this run. And probably about two-thirds of the way through, I really wanted to stop. And I was feeling kind of embarrassed about it and frustrated. And like, I have friends who run half marathons and do triathlons. And I was like, oh my gosh, is it possible I'm not even going to finish this 5K run? But I started playing a little bit of a game in my mind. A few weeks ago, I was recording an episode about, just putting one foot in front of the other and step by step. And I was actually using running on this same path as an example of like just looking to, the next post, the next fence post that is, the next bush, the next just run till there. And I started saying that to myself, just stay running until you get to that tree or that, marker, whatever it was. And again, at that two-thirds point, when I wanted to stop, I really challenged myself and I was like, don't worry about the time. Don't worry about who passes you or doesn't pass you or where you finish. Just see if you can finish this race running. And I realized in that moment, I was humbled by the task. Like, I knew it was going to be something a little bit different. I thought I could do it. I thought I had, trained myself well enough with the running that I do. I usually run for about 20 minutes. This ended up being about 25 minutes. But again, at a little bit of a faster pace and in a different context. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But as I was at that sort of point where I wanted to stop, I was like, oh, this is harder than I thought it was going to be. I am now humbled by this task, and I'm not sure if I can complete it, or I may have to readjust my approach or my goals, or, and I got done. I was proud of myself. I didn't stop. And even down the stretch of it, I actually sped up a little bit, but I was like huffing and puffing and sweating and in ways that I'm not used to as I sort of, walked back to my car and called Michelle and was telling her about the experience. But I sat in my car for a moment just to kind of catch my breath, literally. And I noticed that I felt empowered and enlivened by this feeling of humility, this feeling of being humbled by this task. And I started to think more about how powerful that is. When we let ourselves be humbled by life, when we let ourselves be um, somewhat in awe of, wow, like that was bigger and harder and more involved or more complex or, you know, than I thought, than I realized. Like life happens on the actual field of life, on the court, if you will, not in the stands as we're contemplating it or commenting on it. And I think sometimes when we think about being humbled by life, there's this sense of like being overwhelmed or being knocked, to the ground metaphorically, and that can happen, absolutely. Um, you know, I had a few conversations over the last few days since that experience that really just got me more in touch with being humbled. One of our clients was talking to me yesterday, and we just had this whole conversation about AI and how it's changing their business and business in general and what it's going to mean. And he mentioned something that Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, said he wasn't going to hire any engineers this year. And by the end of the year, many experts are saying that most of, if not all of the code that software developers normally are creating is going to be created by artificial intelligence. And when I started to think about that, now I'm not a software engineer, although I do work with a lot of software engineers and a lot of tech companies. But I just started to think about, well, what does that mean exactly? How is that going to impact people's lives and jobs? And, in the last week, someone else said to me, they were talking to their daughter about what they want to, what she wants to study in college. And she was saying, maybe she wants to be a lawyer or go into law. And this person was saying to me, well, I told her that might not be a good idea with artificial intelligence because are we going to still have lawyers? Um, and again, conversations like that. I don't know what the future holds with respect to artificial intelligence, but AI is clearly here and kind of like the internet or, um, mobile or social or all of these technology movements that have had significant impact on how we live, how we communicate, how we work, how we interact. Someone was talking to me as well over the last few days, and he was talking about moving to the Bay Area back in the early 2000s to work in the tech world. And he was, calling his friends back home saying, even the restaurants out here have websites, right? Like that seemed crazy. Like, why would a restaurant need a website back in 2002? But that was like, high technology and really advanced, and that wasn't happening in lots of other parts of the country. And so, with respect to technology, what is happening right now? What's going to happen in the next 6 months, in the next year, in the next 2, 3, 5 years? I don't know. I spoke at a conference last week um, to a group of folks who work for different nonprofit organizations who do some really incredible work in rural communities, helping people build homes. And a lot of the work that these folks do is funded by programs in the federal government. And at the moment, some of those programs are being cut or being put on hold or being, paused. And so the conversation I was having with everybody in this room, with the reality that they don't know exactly what's going to happen with the future of their work and what they do, how do we operate in the face of that uncertainty? Right? I had another conversation with a client who works in global defense and talking about geopolitics and what's happening with respect to Russia and Ukraine and where the United States fits in all of that. And so many things are happening right now. Again, maybe you're watching or listening to this as these things are happening here in, March of 2025, or maybe at some other point down the road. But like we are in a pretty significant moment of upheaval and disruption and uncertainty on the, roughly the 5-year anniversary of when COVID really took over life as we know it here in the US, and it had been taking over for the previous weeks and months in other parts of the world. And I think about, and I was actually reflecting on that as I was speaking to this group of like, think back to 5 years ago. And when COVID showed up, and all of a sudden we found ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic that none of us had ever dealt with before, none of us knew how to navigate. And even here we are 5 years later, and while the pandemic is no longer, you know, running life and business and the economy as we know it, it significantly disrupted and changed the way that we work, the way that we operate. And I think we're still dealing with and navigating our way through, this sort of post-pandemic world. But that experience, while difficult and challenging and incredibly humbling, also did spark a lot of change, a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, a lot of difference. And I think that's one of the many powers of being humbled, allowing ourselves to be humbled by life. There are so many things that in reality are different than in concept, right? Think about having a baby or getting married. Think about, buying a home or moving across country or going to college or retiring or, getting divorced or, I mean, positive things we would consider positive, more negative things, more challenging things. But in reality, those things are often incredibly humbling. I was listening to a podcast episode this morning, Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert, which I love, and he was talking to, I'm forgetting the man's name who wrote the book Generation Anxious, and he was just talking about these waves of change in technology and how it's impacted us and young people specifically, and raising two, you know, teenage daughters who are right smack dab in the middle of, Generation Z and have been significantly impacted by smartphones and social media, and we're still right in the throes of all of that. I realize how humbling parenthood has been for me, but to parent through this technological transformation as well as the pandemic and other things, not to whine and complain about it or make excuses, but like it's been incredibly humbling. And it was before all of that when they were babies and toddlers back in, they were born in 2006 and 2008. And so, again, I think if there's a way we can think about this sense of humility and realize that, yes, it can be painful at times. Yes, it can knock us on our whats and take us, bring us to our knees, literally or figuratively. But there's also some real power when we do allow ourselves to be humbled by life. Because another side of being humbled is, have you ever had an experience where you did something or you accomplished something or you tapped into something and it was like, wow, where did that come from? This power, this ability, this courage, this insight or wisdom that's like, that's a part of being humbled by life. Like it's like being in awe of life, right? Of our capacity. When I'm often speaking these days and I do reference, the start of COVID and the pandemic, I will say, imagine if 5 years ago I stood up here and said, hey, here's what's about to happen. Like, there's no way we could have imagined that that was real. And even if we did somehow think it was real, there's no way we could assume we'll be able to navigate through that and be okay. And yeah, myself and most of the people that I know and work with and talk to have been somewhat battered and bruised. And, you know, I don't think any of us have made it through the last 5 years without some level of challenge or difficulty to some degree, and some in a pretty significant way. But if we're still here, which everyone watching or listening to this right now, myself included, are, we've made it through this experience. And I think we're a lot more resilient than we realize, right? As I've mentioned a few times recently here on the show, and I've talked about in the past, like a good exercise that we can often do in life when we find ourselves in a difficult situation is to make a list or take some inventory of what are some of the other difficult things that I've experienced and overcome in my life, right? And it's something that I've been talking about recently, but been thinking about, because as we sit here in this time of uncertainty, of um, disruption, fear, difficulty, depending on how you look at things, it's easy to get overwhelmed. It's easy to let that being humbled take us out. But what if it's an opportunity for us to remember how strong we are, remember how resilient we are, remember what we've been able to accomplish, experience, overcome in life, remember what we've been able to navigate through? Those moments of allowing ourselves to be humbled by life can be incredibly powerful if we lean into them. I heard Michael Beckwith years ago say, don't waste a good crisis. Not that we want to be in crisis, not that life has to be crisis after crisis after crisis. And sometimes it can feel that way, especially with, you know, if we're on social media 24/7 and we're looking at what's happening throughout the world, there's crises happening in people's lives and in certain parts of the world all the time. So it can feel that way. But when we're going through an individual or collective crisis, or at least a time of difficulty or a time of uncertainty and just like, I don't know the answer, We can freak out about that. We can run away from that. We can try to jump into some level of certainty about it, or we can really embrace it. There are so many things happening right now that are bigger than we can completely comprehend or understand. Again, artificial intelligence, the state of the world, what's going to happen next? I don't know the answer to most of these things. You know, instability right now in the stock market and the economy. Again, I'm not saying that these things are good or that I like them or I'm happy about them necessarily, but if we can allow ourselves to be humbled in a positive way, in a productive way, in a growth inducing way, that can lead us to new thoughts, new ideas, new questions, new innovations, just a different way of doing things, right? When we get humbled, when life brings us to our knees to some degree, maybe we're forced to literally or figuratively pray or ask for help or look around and go, I don't know how to deal with this. I'm not sure what this means. I'm not sure, right? I've been doing some of that more recently with my business and finding myself connecting with people in different stages of life and different stages of the work that they do, similar to my work, and just asking different questions like, I don't know how to solve this, or I've been struggling with this for a long time, or I'm finding this humbling or overwhelming. What do you think? How do you deal with this? And there's so much power in that if we can get past our own egos, if we can get past our own, obsession with having to know and have all the answers. I remember years ago someone said to me, when you find an answer, your brain shuts off. And then you move on to the next thing, which in life we need to solve problems and come up with answers. And I get it. But what if we could stay in the question a little bit longer? Allow ourselves to inquire into it, allow ourselves to be in that uncomfortable place of not knowing. That's what being humbled is all about, right? And there are times when, beautiful things happen that humble us. The births of children, right? I think about when Rosie and Samantha were born. I think about, just looking at a sunset sometimes or looking at nature or seeing a hummingbird or something. I can be humbled by that. Like, wow, how does that work? I do not know. Even this technology, I talk about this sometimes, but being able to record a podcast, both in audio and now in video as well, it's like you can be listening to this or watching this anywhere in the world. And I'm here in my office recording this early in the morning. And maybe you'll listen to this later today or tomorrow or next week, or maybe you'll listen to this years from now or watch this video or someone will share it with you, or you could be, on your device somewhere very, very far away from me that I'll never be able to travel to and will never have a chance to meet, but you have the ability to listen to and or watch me. And when I think about trying to explain this to someone 20 years ago, 30 years ago, my father, who I often bring up when I'm using this example, who was in radio, who died in 2001, trying to explain to my father what a podcast is and that I basically have my own radio show that's also video as well that can be shared with anyone around the world on a device that my dad wouldn't have even understood because he died in December of 2001. There were no podcasts or smartphones or YouTube or any of it, right? And these are things that are just ubiquitous with us living modern life today, and we don't think that much about it. But it's like I was having a conversation with ChatGPT over the weekend, and I hadn't voice dialogued with AI in that way. I mostly had just been typing, but I was with a friend last week who was talking about doing that, and I just started to have this conversation. I'm like, who am I talking to? It was a very sophisticated conversation that I was appreciating very much, but I was like, what is happening? Another moment of being humbled by life. How did this get created? Who designed this? How does this work? Who am I talking to? How does it know how to respond to me? This is incredible. And at times when I think about it in certain ways, a little scary too, humbling. So where are there aspects of life right now where you can allow yourself to be humbled in a way that's actually productive, in a way that's growth inducing, in a way that can benefit you? Remind you, by the way, that you're human, that at times you're fragile and that we're vulnerable. But again, that healthy reminder of like, whoa. You ever had that happen where you're driving in your car and you almost get into an accident and you stop and realize, whoa, I am operating a pretty significant, sophisticated piece of machinery that's important for me to take my time and be careful. Or you're out in the ocean and all of a sudden a wave comes in and it knocks you down and you go, whoa, Okay. Again, not to be freaked out, but just to be humbled and to realize there's a lot more happening in this whole ecosystem than just me and my thoughts and trying to control things. So if we can really embrace that level of humility, that letting ourselves be humbled by life, sometimes it can be overwhelming and it's like, wow, I bit off more than I could chew, literally. I don't know how to get through this. I'm going to need to come up with some other strategies or some support or some. And sometimes it's really just standing back and being in awe of ourselves, of other human beings, of life, of technology, of nature, of beauty. And there's so much power when we do that. So let's allow ourselves to be humbled in the best possible way. There's a lot happening right now that's humbling, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming in the sense that we give away our power. We actually can take it back to some degree by leaning into that and not being afraid to be humbled. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. There's links in the show notes on the podcast and down below here on YouTube where you can learn more about me and my work or connect with me on social media. Best place to do that is at our website, which is mike-robbins.com. Make sure to hit the follow or the subscribe button if you haven't done so already so you don't miss any future episodes. And we always love it when you leave a rating or a review and share this episode with anyone you think could benefit from it. Until next time, keep showing up fully and, bringing your whole self to work, to life. And remember, we're all in this thing together.